My name is David Madison, the 6th of June 2020. I was a Methodist minister for 9 years, but by the time I had finished my PhD in biblical studies, my belief in God had evaporated. That wasn't supposed to happen. Seminaries exist to manufacture clergy, but if you study the Bible too carefully, too closely, its errors and flaws become all too obvious. Hence this series of videos, Bible Blunders and Bad Theology. I will discuss a lot of them. This is episode 16. One of the most famous scenes in the Gospels is the cleansing of the temple. In the 11th chapter of Mark, verses 15-16, we read this. Then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So, Jesus gets points for standing up to the religious bureaucracy, right? No, bad news. This story doesn't work. One of the top Jesus scholars of our time, Richard Carrier, shows why. Quote, that scene is hardly believable. The temple grounds were enormous, occupying many acres. The temple as a whole occupied nearly 40 acres, and a large portion of that, at least 10 acres, was devoted to public space. Extensively populated, there would have been hundreds of merchants and money changers there, and heavily guarded by an armed force deployed to prevent just this sort of thing. They would have killed Jesus on the spot. So the story is obviously fiction even on that point alone, unquote. Another bit of fiction is verse 16 itself. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Many generations of later readers would have no clue that this was simply impossible. When Matthew and Luke copied the story, they left out this line. Maybe they realized how silly it was. But just what was going on at the Jerusalem temple? It was big business, carrying out the Old Testament laws about sacrificing animals as a part of worship. It's a mystery why Jesus would find that objectionable if he meant what he said in Matthew, that not one bit of the Old Testament law can be ignored. So it's a blunder depicting Jesus upset about what was happening in the temple. And what about those famous money changers whose tables Jesus overturned? People came to the temple to buy animals to sacrifice, but they couldn't bring Roman coinage into the temple because it had the image of the heathen emperor. That would have been sacrilege. So they had to change their Roman coins for temple currency. The Jesus script that Mark created here also includes a quote from Jeremiah about the temple becoming a den of robbers. Jeremiah was scolding people for worshiping other gods, but it's hard to see why the temple merchants could be called robbers. Bear in mind that Mark wrote his gospel after the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed by the Roman army. It didn't exist anymore, and Jewish and Christian theologians alike were trying to figure out why God would let that happen. So maybe the author of Mark's gospel was setting up Jesus as a predictor of the temple's downfall. He was certainly setting up Jesus as a replacement for the temple. That was the belief of the early Jesus cult. But it's a Bible blunder to depict a Galilean peasant preacher storming into the temple and shutting it down, when the same preacher says in Matthew that all of the temple practices were still valid. And it's a blunder that Christian readers today take the story literally, seriously, while overlooking this theological muddle.